The pen stopped mid-signature, just for half a second, like it had realized something Vanessa Cole had not. Stay with me. Because what happened in that room did not explode all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a truth that had been waiting years to breathe. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Whitmore Holdings was silent except for the soft hum of the air system and the faint click of a Mont Blanc pen against heavy paper. The kind of silence that usually meant power was being transferred, not questioned. Vanessa sat at the head of the 12-foot walnut table, posture perfect, shoulders squared, the skyline of Manhattan stretching behind her like a promise she believed she had finally claimed. To everyone watching, she looked exactly like what she had been trying to become for the past 18 months, the woman who stepped in when Eleanor Hayes stepped out, the one who understood how to play the room, how to speak the language of investors, how to wear confidence like a tailored suit. Across from her, Richard Cole leaned back slightly, not smiling, not tense, just observant, as if he were waiting for something he had not explained. That was the first detail that did not quite fit. Vanessa signed the final page, her name flowing in confident strokes. Vanessa Cole, acting authority granted, and slid the document toward the firm's legal counsel, a quiet man named Gregory Pierce who adjusted his glasses but did not immediately pick it up. That pause, barely noticeable, lasted maybe 2 seconds, but in rooms like this, 2 seconds could stretch into something much longer. If you are watching this right now, take a second and hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this do not just reveal what happened, they show you how power really moves. And I am curious, what time is it where you are watching from tonight? Vanessa exhaled slowly, fingers resting on the polished surface, feeling the coolness of the wood ground her. This was it, the final step, the moment everything became official. Except it did not. Gregory finally spoke, voice measured, careful. Before we proceed, there is one clause we need to acknowledge. It was subtle, almost polite, but it landed differently, like a note slightly off in a perfect song. Vanessa's smile held, but her eyes shifted, just slightly, toward page 17, a page she had skimmed, a page she assumed was standard. Outside, a helicopter passed low over the Hudson, its distant thrum vibrating faintly through the glass. And inside that room, for the first time, Vanessa did not feel entirely certain of where she was sitting. Gregory Pierce did not raise his voice, but the shift in the room was immediate, like the air pressure had quietly changed, and only a few people could feel it at first. Vanessa kept her expression composed, her fingers still resting lightly on the table, but her attention narrowed to the document in front of her, specifically to the line Gregory's pen now hovered over without touching. Clause 17 outlines conditional authority, he said, his tone neutral, almost routine, yet no one else moved, not even the junior associates along the wall who had been taking notes moments earlier. Vanessa let out a soft breath through her nose, controlled, measured, the way she had practiced during countless negotiations, and leaned forward just enough to glance at the page again. This time actually reading the paragraph she had skimmed earlier that morning in the back of a black SUV while answering calls and approving statements. The words did not jump out as threatening at first. They were legal, dense, wrapped in phrasing that suggested protection rather than limitation, but there was a structure to it, a condition tied to a name that had not yet been spoken aloud in the room. Across the table, Richard shifted his gaze from the skyline to the paper, then briefly to Vanessa, not intervening, not clarifying, simply observing, and that stillness began to feel intentional rather than passive. Vanessa noticed it now, the way no one was congratulating her, the way the usual rhythm of closing a deal, the nods, the subtle smiles, the quiet relief, had not arrived. Instead, there was waiting. It is standard, Gregory continued, though he did not sound entirely convincing, in cases where original ownership is layered. The word lingered longer than it should have. Vanessa straightened slightly, her confidence not gone but recalibrating, and slid the document back toward herself, tracing the clause with her fingertip as if proximity might make it simpler. Outside, the light had shifted, late afternoon sun casting long reflections across the glass walls, turning the city into something almost unreal, like a projection rather than a place. She had spent months stepping into this world, learning its pace, its language, its expectations, and until this moment, She had believed she had caught up. But something about this clause suggested the race had never been what she thought it was. Layered how? She asked, her voice even, not defensive, just precise. Gregory hesitated, and that hesitation, small as it was, carried more weight than any direct answer. Before he could respond, one of the senior board members, a woman named Claire Whitman who had not spoken once since the meeting began, closed her folder with a soft but deliberate motion. It means, Claire said, her tone calm but unmistakably firm, that authority can be granted, but ownership cannot be assumed. The distinction settled over the table like a quiet verdict. Vanessa felt it then, not panic, not yet, but a subtle misalignment, like standing in a room where the floor was not entirely level. She looked back at the signature she had just written, her name bold and certain at the bottom of the page, and for the first time, it felt less like a claim and more like a test she had not realized she was taking. Somewhere in the building, an elevator chimed, faint and distant, and for reasons she could not explain, Vanessa became aware that this meeting, this moment she had been working toward, might not be the conclusion she had imagined, but the beginning of something far less predictable. Vanessa did not look up immediately, but her mind had already stepped away from the table, tracing backward through the past 18 months with a clarity that felt sharper than anything in front of her. It had not started as ambition, at least not in the way people in rooms like this defined it. It had started with proximity. She met Richard Cole at a fundraising dinner in Tribeca, one of those polished evenings where every conversation sounded like opportunity wrapped in politeness. He had been attentive in a way that felt deliberate, asking questions that made it seem like he saw something others had missed, and when he mentioned Eleanor Hayes, it was never with bitterness, only with a quiet finality, as if that chapter had already been sealed long before Vanessa arrived. At the time, that distinction mattered to her. It made the transition feel clean, almost justified. But now, sitting at the head of this table, she realized how carefully that narrative had been constructed. There had been small things she chose not to examine too closely. The way Eleanor's name still appeared on certain internal documents, always explained as pending updates. The fact that major decisions required a level of approval Richard would casually redirect, saying, "We will formalize it soon." Even the apartment on the Upper West Side, with its understated design and art that did not match Vanessa's taste, had felt less like something new and more like something inherited. She had told herself it was temporary, that once everything was official, she would reshape it, redefine it, make it hers. But official had never fully arrived, only delayed, reframed, postponed. Across the table, Claire Whitman's words echoed again in her mind. Ownership cannot be assumed. Vanessa's gaze drifted briefly to Richard, who remained composed, his expression neutral but not distant, as if he had already accounted for this moment in ways she had not. That realization pressed quietly against her confidence. It was not betrayal in the obvious sense, not a single act she could point to, but something more controlled, more structural. A series of permissions that looked like progress, but never crossed a certain line. She remembered a conversation from 3 months earlier, late at night, when she had asked directly about the final transfer of authority. Richard had smiled, not dismissive, but reassuring, and said, "There are layers to this business. Timing matters." At the time, she had accepted that answer because it aligned with what she wanted to believe. Now the word layers felt less like sophistication and more like distance. Gregory cleared his throat softly, bringing the room back into focus, and began outlining the clause in more detail. But Vanessa was no longer listening to the words themselves. She was listening to the pattern beneath them, the consistent deferral, the way every step forward had been contingent on something unseen. Then came the detail that shifted everything, delivered almost casually, as if it were a footnote rather than a fault line. The original ownership structure, Gregory said, adjusting the document slightly, remains tied to Ms. Hayes through a controlling interest that has not been dissolved. The name landed differently this time, no longer part of the past, but active, present, embedded in the very framework Vanessa believed she was stepping into. For a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow, the edges of the table, the skyline, the faces around her all pulling inward. Eleanor Hayes was not absent. She was not waiting somewhere outside this narrative. She was still inside it, in a way Vanessa had never been allowed to see. And the most unsettling part was not that the ownership remained. It was that everyone else in the room appeared to have known this long before Vanessa did. Richard's silence, Claire's certainty, Gregory's careful phrasing, they were not reactions, they were confirmations. Vanessa's fingers pressed slightly firmer against the paper, grounding herself in something tangible, but the certainty she had carried into the room was no longer intact. It had not been taken from her in a single moment. It had been built on something incomplete from the very beginning. And somewhere beyond the glass walls, beyond the quiet order of this meeting, the real structure of power had been waiting, unchanged, for her to finally notice it. The shift did not come from Gregory this time, or from the documents spread across the table. It came from the door. A soft knock, almost hesitant, followed by the quiet turn of the handle that no one in that room had expected, because meetings like this did not get interrupted, not at this level, not at this stage. Every head turned in near unison, a subtle break in the controlled rhythm that had defined the last hour. Vanessa did not move at first, but her attention locked onto the doorway as it opened just enough to reveal a young assistant, pale, composed but clearly out of place, holding a slim black folder with both hands as if it carried more weight than it should. "Ms. Whitman," the assistant said, directing her voice toward Claire, though her eyes flickered briefly toward Vanessa before settling again. This was marked for immediate review. Claire did not look surprised. That, more than anything, registered. She simply nodded once, extending her hand to receive the folder, her movements precise, unhurried, as if this interruption had been anticipated down to the second. Vanessa felt the room tighten again, not visibly, but structurally, like a system adjusting itself to a new variable. Claire opened the folder without comment, scanning the contents for only a moment before sliding it across the table, not to Gregory, not to Richard, but directly toward Vanessa. The gesture was deliberate. "You should see this," Claire said. Vanessa hesitated, just long enough for the hesitation to mean something, then reached forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the folder before pulling it closer. The first page was not a contract, not structured like the others, but a record, clean, minimal, bearing a header she recognized instantly, Whitmore Holdings Trust Administration. Beneath it, a date, recent, and a list of authorized access logs tied to internal accounts. Her eyes moved quickly, scanning, searching for context, and then slowed as a pattern began to form. Repeated entries under a single designation, E. Hayes, each time-stamped, each marked with clearance levels that extended far beyond anything Vanessa had been granted. The realization did not hit all at once. It settled, piece by piece, like something assembling itself in real time. Eleanor Hayes was not just connected to ownership on paper. She had been actively accessing the system, reviewing, monitoring, possibly influencing decisions from within the same structure Vanessa believed she was stepping into. Vanessa's grip on the folder tightened. Slightly, the texture of the paper suddenly more present under her fingertips. She looked up, first at Claire, then at Gregory, and finally at Richard, searching for any sign that this was being interpreted the same way she was experiencing it. Richard met her gaze, steady, unreadable, and for the first time, there was no reassurance in it, only acknowledgement. That was enough. "These entries," Vanessa said, her voice controlled but lower now, more focused, "they are current." It was not a question. Claire inclined her head slightly. "Within the last 72 hours, she confirmed. The timeline closed in. This was not history. This was now. Vanessa leaned back just enough to create space between herself and the document, as if distance might allow her to process it differently. But the implication had already taken hold. Eleanor was not waiting to be revealed. She was already operating, already present in the systems that define power in this room. And if that was true, then Vanessa's position was not just incomplete, it was provisional in a way no one had explained. The choice in front of her shifted instantly. This was no longer about signing, about stepping into a role that had been prepared for her. It was about deciding whether to challenge a structure she did not fully understand or to accept a version of authority that could be withdrawn just as quietly as it had been offered. The room remained still, but the expectation had changed. Vanessa could feel it in the way attention settled back onto her, not as a participant completing a process, but as someone being measured in real time. She closed the folder slowly, aligning its edges with the table as if restoring order to something that had slipped. When she spoke again, the tone had shifted, less about certainty, more about control. "Then I need to know," she said, her eyes moving deliberately across the room, landing once more on Richard. "What exactly has been in motion while I have been signing?" The question did not break the silence. It deepened it, and in that space, the next move was no longer procedural. It was personal. No one answered Vanessa immediately, and that absence of response felt less like hesitation and more like a decision already made somewhere beyond her reach. It was Gregory who finally moved, but not to speak. Instead, he adjusted the folder in front of him and slid a second document from beneath it, thinner, more discreet, the kind of paper that did not belong in standard boardroom circulation. He did not announce it. He simply placed it on the table between them, angled slightly toward Vanessa, as if offering it without formally presenting it. That distinction mattered. Vanessa did not touch it right away. She studied Gregory instead, the way his posture remained neutral, but his eyes no longer met hers directly, drifting instead toward Claire for a fraction of a second before returning to the table. It was a small gesture, but it suggested alignment, not with Vanessa, but with something already in motion. "This came in late last night," Gregory said finally, his voice measured, careful not to assign it too much weight, while simultaneously ensuring it could not be ignored. Vanessa reached for the document, slower this time, aware that whatever she was about to read had not been included by accident. The header was unfamiliar at first glance: Sterling and Rowe Advisory Group, a firm known quietly in certain circles for restructuring ownership disputes that never reached public courtrooms. That alone shifted the tone. This was not internal. This was external influence. Her eyes moved down the page, scanning language that was less about control and more about contingency, outlining a review of beneficial ownership alignment and fiduciary exposure under transitional authority. The phrasing was technical, but the implication was clear enough. Someone outside this room had been invited to evaluate the structure she was stepping into, and that evaluation was still ongoing. Vanessa looked up, this time not at Richard, but at Claire. "Who engaged them?" she asked, her voice steady, though the question carried more weight than before. Claire did not respond immediately. Instead, she folded her hands lightly on the table, her expression composed in a way that suggested this was not new information to her. "They were brought in to ensure continuity," Claire said, the words precise but intentionally incomplete. Continuity of what? Vanessa wondered, and more importantly, for whom? The answer did not come directly. It revealed itself in the next line Vanessa read, a single name embedded within the advisory notes, not highlighted, not emphasized, but present in a way that could not be overlooked. Eleanor Hayes. Not as owner this time, not as a distant authority, but as a participating party under review. The phrasing was subtle, but it shifted everything again. Eleanor was not just observing. She was engaging, through channels Vanessa had not even known existed. A quiet recalibration settled over Vanessa's thoughts. This was no longer a closed system she had been gradually entering. It was layered, interconnected, influenced by actors who did not sit at this table yet shaped everything happening on it. Gregory cleared his throat softly, as if to anchor the moment before it drifted too far into speculation. "Their preliminary findings are not final," he added, though the reassurance felt procedural rather than meaningful. Vanessa nodded once, more to herself than to anyone else, her attention returning to the document, this time reading more carefully, looking not just for information, but for intent. Why now? Why this firm? Why involve an external review at the exact moment she was being formalized into authority? The questions did not create panic. They created distance, a step back from the narrative she had been given, allowing her to see its structure more clearly. And in that structure, she began to notice something else, something that had not been obvious before. Every layer, every delay, every additional review had one consistent effect. It kept her just outside of full control, positioned close enough to act, but never fully empowered to decide. Vanessa closed the document gently, aligning it with the others, her movements deliberate, controlled, as if maintaining order could somehow clarify the shifting ground beneath it. When she looked up again, her gaze settled not on Claire or Gregory, but on Richard, and this time there was no search for reassurance in it. Only analysis. So this is still being evaluated, she said, not as a question, but as a conclusion. Richard inclined his head slightly, acknowledging without expanding, and in that restrained response, another realization took shape. Whatever Sterling and Rowe was doing, whatever Eleanor's role had become, Richard was not outside of it. He was part of the structure that allowed it to happen. And for the first time since she entered the room, Vanessa understood that the power she thought she was claiming might never have been his to give in the first place. The room did not shift all at once, but something underneath it did, something structural, like a foundation revealing a fault line only after the weight had already been placed on top of it. Vanessa did not speak again immediately. Instead, she reached back to the first folder Claire had handed her, the access logs, and pulled it closer, this time not scanning for patterns, but isolating specifics, narrowing her focus to the timestamps, the authorization codes, the pathways Eleanor Hayes had used to move through the system. It was not random access. It was precise, targeted. Every entry aligned with moments Vanessa now recognized, key approvals, financial reallocations, internal messaging shifts that had quietly redirected momentum over the past several weeks. At the time, those changes had been explained as operational adjustments, nothing unusual, nothing worth questioning. But now, placed against this record, they formed something else entirely. A coordinated presence. Vanessa's fingers paused over one entry in particular, a timestamp from 48 hours earlier, tied to a restricted ledger she had attempted to access that same morning and had been told was still under review. The denial had seemed procedural at the time. Now it read like a boundary. She lifted her gaze slowly, not to challenge, but to confirm what she was beginning to understand. She is not just monitoring, Vanessa said, her voice quieter now, more deliberate. She is directing flow. Gregory did not correct her. That, more than any confirmation, was enough. But it was not the full truth. Not yet. Claire shifted slightly in her seat, the first movement that suggested something more was about to surface. And with that motion, she reached into the same black folder and removed a final document, one that had not been shared before, its edges still perfectly aligned, untouched by the discussion so far. She did not slide it across the table this time. She held it, just for a moment, as if deciding how much of it to reveal. There is a reason Sterling and Rowe was engaged, Claire said, her tone measured, but no longer neutral, and it is not only about ownership alignment. The distinction settled heavily in the space between them. Vanessa did not interrupt. She simply waited, her attention fixed, aware that whatever came next would not just clarify the structure, it would redefine her position within it. Claire placed the document down, turning it toward Vanessa with a slight rotation, enough to signal that this was no longer optional information. Vanessa leaned forward, her focus narrowing again, but this time the document did not resemble anything she had seen so far. It was not a contract. It was not a report. It was a timeline. Clean, chronological, spanning just over 2 years, marked with key events, acquisitions, internal restructuring points, and embedded within it, subtle notations that tied decisions to specific authorizations. At first glance, it looked like a standard strategic overview. But then Vanessa noticed the annotations, initials placed next to certain entries, small, almost invisible unless you were looking for them. Yates appeared again and again, not just in recent entries, but woven throughout the entire timeline, long before Vanessa had entered the picture. That alone shifted the narrative. Eleanor Hayes had not stepped away. She had stepped back. The distinction was quiet, but absolute. Vanessa's eyes moved further down the page, tracing the sequence, and then stopped at a section marked Transitional Phase Initiation, dated approximately 18 months ago, the same period Vanessa had first met Richard. Beneath it, a note, concise, deliberate, external candidate integration authorized. Vanessa did not react outwardly, but internally, something recalibrated. External candidate. The phrasing was clinical, detached, but it pointed in only one direction. She was not an accident. She was not simply someone who had stepped into an opening. She had been part of a process, defined before she even knew it existed. The realization did not arrive as shock. It arrived as alignment, pieces falling into place that had never quite connected before. The delays, the layered authority, the careful positioning. All of it had served a function beyond her understanding. "You are saying," Vanessa began, her voice steady but slower now, as if each word required confirmation before it could be released, "that my role here was planned." Claire did not deny it, but she did not fully confirm it either. "Your presence," Claire said carefully, "coincided with a necessary phase in the company's evolution." It was an answer that revealed just enough while withholding intent. Vanessa leaned back slightly, creating space again, but this time the distance did not bring clarity. It expanded the complexity. If she had been integrated, then by whom? If Eleanor had authorized it, then to what end? And more importantly, what was the outcome that this entire structure was moving toward? Gregory spoke again, but his voice carried a different weight now, less procedural, more explanatory. "Sterling and Rose's role," he said, "is to assess exposure risk during transitional control periods, particularly when ownership and operational authority are intentionally separated." The phrase "intentionally separated" lingered. This was not a flaw in the system. It was design. Vanessa's gaze returned to the timeline, to the repeated presence of to the moment marked as her own entry point, and then to the most recent notation, dated within the last 72 hours, "final evaluation pending." The words sat there, quiet, unassuming, but loaded with implication. Final of what? Evaluation of whom? The room did not answer those questions. It held them. And in that stillness, one more detail emerged, not from the documents, but from the structure itself. Every step had led here, not to grant her power, but to measure it. And somewhere beyond the information she had just uncovered, beyond the timeline and the logs and the carefully constructed layers, there was still a missing piece, one that had not yet been placed on the table. A piece that would determine whether Vanessa was meant to step forward or step aside. Vanessa did not reach for another document this time, and that in itself marked the shift. The urgency that had defined her earlier movements dissolved into something quieter, more deliberate, as if reacting too quickly would only confirm the role she had just realized she had been placed in. Instead, she leaned back fully in her chair, allowing a small but intentional pause to settle over the room, not as hesitation, but as control reclaimed in increments. Her gaze moved across the table slowly, not searching for answers anymore, but mapping positions, aligning behaviors, identifying who was reacting and who was simply waiting. Claire remained composed, hands folded, posture unchanged. Gregory had returned to stillness, his pen resting parallel to the edge of his folder. Richard, however, had shifted slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for Vanessa to register that the balance had moved, even if only a fraction. That was where she began. "I want a copy of the full advisory report," Vanessa said, her tone even, not demanding, but precise, as if the request had already been approved somewhere beyond the room. No one interrupted. That silence worked in her favor. She continued before it could be filled. "And I want access to the same ledger Eleanor has been reviewing. Not a summary. Direct access." This time, Gregory glanced at Claire before responding, a reflex Vanessa had been watching for. "That level of clearance is restricted," he said carefully, but the phrasing lacked finality. Restricted was not denied. Vanessa nodded once, as if acknowledging a technicality rather than a barrier. "Then we adjust the restriction," she replied, her eyes not leaving his, holding the line just long enough to make the request less about permission and more about process. It was subtle, but it shifted the frame. She was no longer asking to be included. She was redefining the terms of inclusion. Claire studied her for a moment, longer than before, as if reassessing something that had already been measured. "Access can be reviewed," Claire said, choosing her words with care, "but it requires alignment." Alignment. The word carried multiple meanings in this room, and Vanessa understood that now. It was not about agreement. It was about positioning. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she reached for the timeline again, but not to reread it, only to close it, aligning it with the rest of the documents in a neat, controlled stack. The gesture was quiet, almost administrative, but it signaled something else, that she was no longer absorbing information, she was organizing it, preparing it. Her mind moved through the pieces quickly now, not in fragments, but in structure. Eleanor's access was not hidden, it was documented. The advisory firm was not external pressure, it was an instrument. The timeline was not history, it was a framework still in motion. And somewhere within that framework, there was a point of leverage that had not yet been used. Vanessa shifted her attention back to Richard, not confrontational, but direct. "You knew this phase was not complete," she said, her voice steady, almost observational. Richard did not deny it. That was enough. It confirmed what she needed without revealing intent. Vanessa let that settle, then redirected her focus to the room as a whole, broadening the scope of her attention. "Then we proceed as if it is not complete," she added, her tone calm, but now carrying a subtle authority that had not been there before. It was not declared. It was assumed. That distinction mattered. A faint movement near the glass wall caught her peripheral vision, just enough to register without drawing attention from the others. Someone had paused outside the boardroom, visible only as a reflection against the city skyline, standing still for a moment longer than necessary before moving on. Vanessa did not look directly, but she noted the timing. The meeting had reached a point where observation extended beyond the table. That detail stayed with her. She returned her attention inward, not to react, but to adjust. "I will need time with these documents," she said, more to establish the next step than to request it, "and I expect the review to include my position, not just the structure." It was a careful insertion, placing herself back into the evaluation without challenging it outright. Gregory nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a procedural necessity. Claire did not respond, but her silence no longer felt like control. It felt like consideration. Vanessa gathered the top document, not taking everything, just enough to signal intent, and placed it in front of her, aligning it once more. The room remained quiet, but the tension had changed. It was no longer centered on what had been revealed. It was focused on what would happen next. And for the first time since the meeting began, Vanessa was not reacting to the structure around her. She was beginning to move within it, not fully visible, not fully defined, but no longer passive. Somewhere beyond the glass, the city continued without pause. But inside that room, something else had begun to take shape, something slower, more controlled, and far less predictable than anyone had anticipated. The decision did not unfold in that room. It was set into motion by it, carried outward into a space where visibility itself became part of the equation. 48 hours later, the setting shifted to the atrium of Whitmore Holdings headquarters, a glass-enclosed expanse stretching nearly 60 feet high, where light poured in from above and every sound echoed just enough to be noticed, but never fully contained. It was not a boardroom, not a private negotiation space. It was designed for presence, for statements that needed to be seen as much as heard. Employees moved along the perimeter, executives gathered in small clusters, and a select group of media representatives had been invited under the premise of a strategic leadership update, a phrase broad enough to conceal intent while still drawing attention. Vanessa stood near the center of it, not elevated on a stage, not separated by distance, but positioned where movement naturally slowed around her, where conversations adjusted without fully stopping. She had chosen this space carefully. In a room built on transparency, control had to be exercised differently. It had to be layered. The first shift came quietly. Gregory Pierce approached with a slim tablet, not a stack of documents, not physical evidence that could be easily dismissed, but a live interface connected to the internal systems Vanessa had requested access to. He did not announce it. He simply handed it to her with a slight nod, an acknowledgement that something previously restricted had been opened, at least partially. Vanessa accepted it without looking down immediately, letting the presence of the device register before its content did. Around them, the low hum of conversation continued, but attention had already begun to drift inward, drawn by proximity, by the subtle change in posture among those who understood that something beyond routine was unfolding. Claire Whitman stood a few feet away, composed as always, but no longer static. There was a readiness in her stance, as if she had anticipated this progression but had not fully predicted its form. Richard remained further back, near one of the glass columns, his position deliberately neutral, neither aligned nor detached, but observant in a way that suggested he was measuring outcomes rather than influencing them. Vanessa finally looked down at the tablet. The interface was clean, minimal, displaying access logs similar to those she had reviewed earlier, but now they were live, updating in real time, each entry timestamped to the second, each movement within the system recorded with precision. She scrolled slowly, not to find something new, but to confirm what had already been implied. Eleanor Hayes was still active, her access not just recent, but ongoing, her presence embedded in the operational rhythm of the company. Vanessa lifted her gaze, not to the screen above, not yet, but to the people around her, allowing the silence to deepen just enough that when she spoke, it carried without force. "There is a distinction," she said, her voice steady, measured to travel without strain, between being granted authority and actually holding control. The statement was not confrontational. It was observational, but it shifted the tone immediately. Conversations at the edges quieted. Movement slowed. The second layer followed without pause. Vanessa tapped the screen once, and the data mirrored onto a large display suspended above the atrium, not as a presentation, but as a live feed, unfiltered, unedited. Names, timestamps, access levels, all visible, all undeniable. There was no commentary attached to it, no explanation offered, just information. That choice mattered. It forced interpretation. A murmur moved through the crowd, not loud, but present, a collective recognition that what they were seeing had not been intended for this level of visibility. Claire stepped forward slightly, not to interrupt, but to position herself within the unfolding moment. "This data reflects ongoing internal processes," she said, her tone controlled, offering context without denying the content. Vanessa nodded once, acknowledging the statement without conceding anything. "It reflects structure," Vanessa replied, "and structure defines outcome." The phrasing was deliberate, broad enough to avoid direct accusation, but specific enough to anchor the moment in something real. The third layer arrived with less subtlety. Gregory moved again, this time connecting the advisory report from Sterling and Rowe to the display, overlaying sections of analysis that had previously remained within documents, now visible in fragments, key phrases highlighted not by design, but by selection. Transitional authority subject to external validation. Operational control contingent upon beneficial ownership alignment. The language was technical, but in this setting, its implications became accessible, even to those without legal training. Vanessa did not explain it. She allowed the words to sit, to be read, to be processed independently. That restraint created its own tension. Claire's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not to alarm, but to recognition. The narrative was no longer contained within internal channels. It was being reframed in real time. Richard's position did not change, but his attention sharpened, his gaze fixed not on Vanessa, but on the display itself, as if recalculating based on variables that had just become public. Vanessa introduced the next element with precision. "Eleanor Hayes," she said, and this time the name carried differently, no longer an internal reference, but a focal point, "is not a former participant in this structure." The statement landed without resistance. The evidence above supported it. But Vanessa did not stop there. She shifted the screen again, isolating a specific segment of the timeline Claire had shown her, the transitional phase initiation, and beneath it, the notation that had redefined everything. "External candidate integration authorized." The words appeared above them, simple, unembellished, and for a moment, the entire atrium seemed to pause. The implication spread quickly, not through explanation, but through connection. Vanessa allowed that connection to form before speaking again. That integration, she continued, her tone unchanged, was not incidental. It was a statement that did not accuse, but it redirected the narrative entirely. The attention that had been diffused across the room now centered, not on Eleanor, not on Claire, but on Vanessa herself. The fourth layer introduced uncertainty rather than clarity. Vanessa turned off the live feed abruptly, the screen returning to a neutral display, cutting the visual thread just as it had begun to solidify. That interruption created a new tension, one built on absence rather than presence. "What has not been shown," she said, her voice quieter now, drawing the focus inward again, "is why this structure was designed to operate this way." The question was implicit. The answer was not provided. That gap held the room. Claire stepped forward fully now, no longer at the edge, her posture signaling engagement rather than observation. "There are considerations that extend beyond what is appropriate for public discussion," she said, her tone firm but controlled. Vanessa met her gaze directly, not challenging, but steady. Then we should define what is appropriate, she replied, the words measured, but carrying a weight that suggested the boundaries were no longer fixed. The final shift in the sequence came not from Vanessa, but from the system itself. A new entry appeared on the display, not triggered by her, not part of the prepared sequence, but live, time-stamped within that exact moment. Hayes. Access level, executive override. The timing was precise enough to feel intentional. The crowd noticed it almost immediately, the subtle murmur returning, this time sharper, more focused. Vanessa did not look surprised. She watched the entry appear, then lifted her gaze slowly, scanning the space as if expecting something more. The hook did not resolve. It expanded. Eleanor was not just present in the system. She was responding. And in that response, the structure that had seemed controlled, measured, and contained revealed something else entirely. It was active, adaptive, and no longer operating solely within the boundaries Vanessa had chosen to expose. The atrium held that realization, suspended between what had been revealed and what remained just out of reach, and in that suspended moment, the balance of power did not collapse. It shifted, subtly, continuously, into something far more complex than anyone in that room had fully anticipated. No one spoke when the new entry appeared, not immediately, because the system itself had already said enough. The timestamp remained on the screen for a few seconds longer than expected, long enough for it to settle into everyone's awareness as something real, not theoretical, not historical. Then, just as quietly as it had arrived, the display dimmed, returning to its neutral state, as if the building itself had decided the moment was complete. The conversations that followed did not erupt. They fractured, breaking into smaller, quieter exchanges at the edges of the atrium, where meaning was processed in lowered voices and careful glances. Claire Whitman stepped back first, not in retreat, but in recalibration, her role no longer centered, her authority now part of a structure that had been publicly reframed. Gregory gathered his materials with deliberate precision, aligning papers that no longer carried the same weight they had just hours earlier. Richard remained where he was, but something in his posture had shifted, not defeat, not even resistance, but recognition, as if the outcome he had been measuring had finally reached its visible form. Vanessa did not move right away. She stood in the same place, the glass ceiling above her reflecting a softened version of the city, her expression composed, but no longer carrying the urgency that had brought her there. The plan had not dismantled the structure. It had revealed it, and in doing so, it had changed who could move within it without question. Across the room, a small detail closed the distance between what had been and what would follow. The assistant who had delivered the folder earlier now stood near the entrance, holding a new badge, one printed with a single name, Eleanor Hayes, marked with full executive clearance. It was not announced. It did not need to be. Vanessa noticed it, just briefly, and then looked away, not in avoidance, but in acceptance of what the moment had clarified. Power had not been taken or lost in a single act. It had been defined, slowly, through visibility. Vanessa turned slightly, stepping out of the center without hesitation, her role no longer uncertain, but also no longer what she had first believed it to be. The room adjusted around her, not dramatically, but enough to acknowledge the shift. Some positions do not belong to those who reach for them, but to those who understand when to stop reaching. If this moment made you think, feel free to share your perspective and stay with the story. Thank you.